How are regimes generally overthrown, and how do authoritarian states generally transfer to democracy? The answer, more often than not, isn't popular revolution by protesters or revolutionaries deposing the government. Sometimes an authoritarian leader will step down due to these popular demands by their populations, but also authoritarian rulers do tend to use security forces to put down these protests and movements, often brutally by force. Most of the time, the primary condition in an authoritarian regime change is a security forces defection. By definition, a security forces defection in international affairs is where the military, police, and other security forces of the state no longer follow the orders of the state and support the anti-government protesters, revolutionaries, and/or rebel movements. But note, a security forces defection is not a coup d'etat. A coup is where the security forces overthrow the government, while a security forces defection is where the security forces join a popular movement to bring about a regime change. Here are some case studies to give you a better idea of how this was worked in history. Augusto Pinochet's Chile was undoubtedly a brutal dictatorship and was not overly popular among the Chilean population. However, protests and demonstrations against the dictatorship were relatively ineffective in the 1980s, and Pinochet would only step down from power after losing a 1988 referendum to extend his rule, which he only initiated from outside pressure from Pope John Paul II and the closing of the Cold War. However, a major factor was the role of Pinochet's security forces. The Chilean military no longer held a role in civilian politics, and many of the dictator's generals said that they would support a newly elected government, showing their loyalty to the state over the regime. So, after losing his election, Pinochet was forced to leave office. Another case study from the end of the Cold War is the fall of the USSR. It's no secret that the Soviet Union was a pretty authoritarian state, and when the state was on its way to the crapper, Soviet hardliners did everything that they could to try to maintain the Soviet Union. This was the August coup. Because the hardliners, although government actors, were attempting to use the military to try to prevent the Soviet Union from falling. Anyway, many Soviet military units did not follow orders given to them, and lots of units which did respond would end up joining the anti-Soviet and pro-democracy protesters. Turning to a 21st century case study, Egypt in 2011 saw dictator Hosni Mubarak resign following mass protests from the Arab Spring, and then Mohamed Morsi was elected to the Egyptian presidency. However, Morsi would not prove to be popular or democratic, as mass protests against his administration would spawn all over the country. Reasons for demanding Morsi's resignation include accusations of increasing authoritarianism and his pushing of an Islamist agenda disregarding the predominantly secular opposition or rule of law. The uprisings concluded 7 months of protests that started when Morsi's government issued a highly controversial constitutional declaration that gave him temporary, sweeping powers over the state's judicial system until a new constitution would be passed. The June 30th protests resulted in the overthrow of Morsi by the Egyptian military 3 days later. Despite the result essentially appearing as a coup, this case is a security forces defection, as the military sides with the mass protests and their grievances over the government. Another case study for security forces defections in a more modern context is the Syrian Civil War. When the Civil War first began, various elements of the Syrian armed forces defected to rebel groups, but the majority remained loyal to the regime. However, this status quo would not remain. One of the main reasons why the 2024 Syrian opposition offensive was so successful in taking much of the Syrian territory and getting Assad to flee was because of a security forces defection. You see, with sanctions on Syria, the country wasn't making much money, but the Assad regime engaged in a lot of drug dealing to smuggle Captagon, which is basically meth, all across the Arab world, and in doing so, Assad enriched himself. But Assad would not pay his security forces a cut of this, and they began defecting en masse to the opposition, because who wants to fight for a regime where all the dictator does is enrich himself through the drug trade while cutting your pay? A security forces defection can also be situations where they are merely standing by and not opposing the anti-regime revolutionaries instead of outright joining them. Here, the security forces are now not doing their job of acting as the regime's monopoly on violence. And if you didn't already know, the main qualifying factor for a state is the government's monopoly on violence. And when the security forces are not acting as the government's monopoly, regardless of sentiments for or against anti-regime groups, a defection has occurred in some way, shape, or form. Here's one solid example where this was the case. During the 1917 Russian Revolution, the Russian military barely opposed the Bolshevik takeover of the country and remained essentially neutral for a while. Sure, various elements joined the Bolsheviks and other radical groups, as was the case with the Kronstadt sailors, while others remained in the pro-government camp and would oppose the Bolshevik takeover, such as the Women's Battalion of Death. But for the most part, regarding regime change from the provisional government to the Bolsheviks in the October Revolution, the Russian army kinda just sat there until the Russian Civil War began. There are a lot more cases of both types of security forces defections, but I figure I should wrap this up here. What did you think? Did you know about security forces defections before this video? What other examples can you think of? Write in the comments, and thank you for watching.